Hi there, it's Dr. Simon Ali here again, and today we're going to talk about stress and the effects of stress on the body and the effects of stress on the brain. I've had a number of inquiries on the effects of stress on the brain and how this manifests itself and what sorts of problems it can cause, not only in the body but in the brain itself, in terms of specific areas of the brain and what types of problems for cognitive processing and decision making that stress has an effect on. Before we go and talk a little bit about all of this, I'll just give you a quick rundown on what we're going to be talking about, which is stress, the stress response, how that manifests itself in the body and the effects it has on the body, and then we're going to move on and talk about the effects of this stress on your central nervous system and or the brain. We all have heard of this term stress, and we've all heard of good stress and we've heard of bad stress. I want to put this into some perspective for you of what is good stress and what is bad stress. There isn't a single animal, human being on the face of the earth that does not have a stress response. So it is an important response, and I'll put it out there right from the word go and tell you that the stress response really is something that we require to prepare the body, to prepare the brain for peak performance. And that's the terminology that we're going to be using, for peak performance. When we have an acute form of stress, that is stress that comes on quickly but leaves us quickly, this is what we term good stress. However, when stress is sustained over longer periods of time, so that it's a chronic process, then this becomes what we term bad stress. And I want to tell you a little bit about stress. Stress and the father of stress. The father of stress really is Hans Selye, and in the early part or mid part of the last century, he coined what we now know as being the general adaptation syndrome, GAS, or the general adaptation syndrome. GAS really has three phases: the alarm phase, the flight-fight phase, the resistance phase, which we'll talk about in a second, and then there's the exhaustion. And really, when you get to the stage of exhaustion, you're pretty much done for, and that rapidly leads to death. But let's talk about Hans Selye's general adaptation syndrome and adopt it to modern day terminologies. And the modern day terminologies of stress is this alarm phase or this flight-fight response. And that we know as being a neuronal response. So stress really has two phases as far as we're concerned before the third phase, which is death. And that is the flight-fight response, which today we know as this neuronal response, and that is more activation of the sympathetic nervous system. And it manifests itself in the release of this hormone adrenaline or epinephrine, as well as noradrenaline or norepinephrine, from a couple of little glands that sit above your kidneys, which is the adrenal glands. And the adrenal glands release adrenaline, which prepares the body for peak performance, prepares the brain for peak performance. So what does adrenaline do? Well, adrenaline is responsible for increases in your cardiovascular function. So your heart rate and the pounding of your heart increases. It causes an increase in respiration. It causes dilation of your pupils. And all of this allows for an increase in blood flow, an increase in light that comes into the eyes, so it increases sight, for example. It also causes vasoconstriction and vasodilation in certain parts of the body, so blood is redirected from where you don't need it, which is in the stomach, in the gastrointestinal system. Who wants to digest food while you're undergoing a flight-fight response? But you need that blood to your muscles, you need that blood to your brain to prepare you for peak performance. So it's actually a good thing, this release of adrenaline, and this is what we call the flight-fight or the acute phase. The other side of this response is the so-called endocrine or the hormonal phase. And the hormonal phase is much to do about the release of one very important hormone, which is cortisol. The action of cortisol is to supplement the sympathetic responses. So it actually increases the actions of adrenaline at the various parts, or what adrenaline does at the various parts of your body. And it supplements it, increases it, and it sustains it. However, if there's a stressor that continues, whether it be a physical stressor or whether it be a psychological stressor, and I'll define those terms for you. A physical stressor may be a stressor where there are physical constraints on your body, such as increases in temperature, decreases in temperature, or if you're sitting in an uncomfortable position for long periods of time. All of these are stressors. Going for a marathon run or a sprint run, all of these are stressors on the body, physical type stressors, and they will lead to an increase not only in the sympathetic activation but also in the hormonal activation, which is cortisol. But there's also psychological stresses, the anxiety type stresses, where I could be just sitting here or standing here thinking about what's happening outside of that door. Is there someone who's going to come through that door and harass me? Is there someone who's going to come through that door and fight me? I don't know. I don't know. But if I continue to think about it, particularly if it's dark and it's creepy, then that's going to set up the same stress response. The sad thing is that psychological stressors are in fact much greater output in cortisol than physical stressors. But psychological stressors can also be sustained, and this can lead to chronic responses where we've got large amounts of cortisol that are being released, but also that are sustained. So what does cortisol do other than supplement the neuronal responses? Well, cortisol is also an anti-inflammatory agent. We've heard of cortisone or hydrocortisone, which are products that are put into topical creams that we rub. We've heard of injections into joints to reduce swelling, so it's an anti-inflammatory. Anti-inflammatory means that it reduces the function or the action of the immune system. By reducing the action of your immune system, you shut down your immune system. What does that do to your body? It makes you a lot more susceptible to infections by pathogens, for example. So the person who's chronically stressed is the one that's always got a sniffle in the nose, or it's got some sort of a rash on the skin as a result of the shutdown of the immune system. Cortisol also plays havoc with your metabolic system. Cortisol actually increases your blood glucose levels. So sustained increases of blood glucose levels is some things that can lead to things like diabetes. So sustained amounts of cortisol are actually very, very bad for you. It can lead to obesity. It can lead to redirection of fat from around your body to abdominal fat around your belly, which we know is dangerous type of fat. It can lead to cardiovascular disease. It can lead to, as we've said, things like diabetes. It can lead to cancers. And it's thought that increases in cortisol, or this chronic type of stress, which we call distress, is responsible for over 90% of visits to a GP, because it starts with an increase in cortisol and manifests itself in some other pathology. In addition to cortisol, we have some more hormones like thyroid hormones and growth hormone, which we don't regularly think of as being stress hormones, but they are released in the stress response, and they're generally responsible for supplementing the body, making sure that there's sufficient amounts of energy for the flight-fight response and for the resistance phase, which is this hormonal phase, to try and counter the effects of stress. So good stress we all need in order for peak performance. However, bad stress, which is the state of being in chronic stress, is something that can be very, very deleterious to the body. Not only very, very deleterious to the body, but it can also be very, very deleterious to the brain. How so? Well, we know that cortisol is responsible for lapses in memory or memory problems. There's a region of the brain which we call the hippocampus that is responsible for memory, and in particular storing short-term or going from short-term memory to long-term memory. And the hippocampus is a region of the brain that is jam-packed full of cortisol receptors, and it's cortisol that binds to its receptors and brings about their actions. And during the stress response, the number of receptors are actually increased. And if the stress response is continued, what typically happens to the hippocampus in not only animal but human studies is that the size of the hippocampus decreases, and the connections within the hippocampus, and the connections is what the brain is all about. This is where we get all of that complexity, all of that wonderful complexity that is the brain, that comes from all that. The hippocampus connections are actually reduced. What is the manifestation of that? Well, it does lead to memory problems. It does lead to memory problems. Acute stress is good for memory. You get an increase in blood flow to the brain, that's actually a good thing for memory. But chronic stress leads to memory problems. Conversely, when we look at the structure at the end of the hippocampus, the amygdala is actually increased in size, and the amygdala is responsible for your fear and anxiety type reactions, those rage type reactions. And with the amygdala, not only do we get an increase in size, but the connections, that complexity in the functionality is actually increased in chronic stress. And that can lead to a cycle of fear and anxiety in patients, and they can't get out of that cycle of fear and anxiety. So it's a converse reaction at the amygdala compared to the hippocampus. In fact, the amygdala is actually responsible, because it is part of that limbic system, that emotional brain that we have. The amygdala is responsible for largely starting off the cortisol production process. So if you have sustained cortisol production, you can see that you're going to get an enlarged amygdala. During chronic stress, we have an increase in this amino acid that floods the brain, which is glutamate. In the central nervous system, this amino acid glutamate is actually a neurotransmitter. It's an excitatory neurotransmitter, and that's increased in concentration, in the amount. One of the things that happens with an increase in glutamate is that we get an increase in reactive oxygen species, and these are free radicals. And if you've done any reading over the past 5 years in popular science magazines, even popular health magazines, you'll realise that free radicals are very, very dangerous for us, and that they are largely responsible for destruction of cells. So free radicals can kill cells. And if you've got an increase in glutamate as a result of chronic stress, you get an increase in free radicals, therefore an increase in cell death. And this increase in cell death is compounded by a decrease in this protein, the BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and as the name suggests, it's a neurotrophic factor, which means that it is responsible for the production of new cells, sustaining cellular growth and the production of new cells. Coupled together with a reduction in BDNF and an increase in free radicals, not only do we get an increase in cell death, but we get a decrease in the capacity of the brain to make new cells. So you can see what's going to happen. We're going to get areas of cells dying, and that's going to cause things like depression, OCD, and decreases in BDNF have been associated with depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, dementia, as well as Alzheimer's disease. All of this, of course, can lead to things like decreases in cognitive function, and depending on where these cellular death is occurring, particularly if it's occurring in the frontal lobes, you're going to have poor decision-making capacity in the frontal lobe as well as the parietal lobe. You're going to get lots of cognitive difficulties, and these are the sorts of things that neuropsychologists, of course, are in the business of measuring. You get an imbalance of certain neurotransmitters, particularly serotonin and dopamine. Serotonin, we know, is an excitatory hormone that floods the brain, that is responsible for causing your neurons to activate, and a decrease in serotonin, we know, can cause depression. In fact, most of your drugs for depression are specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which causes an effective increase in serotonin at junctions between neurons to help fire them up. Has anyone heard of telomeres? Telomeres is being studied very heavily at the moment. Telomeres are cappings at the end of chromosomes in every single cell of your body. And it's thought that the longer the telomere, the longer is the longevity, or the increased longevity within those cells. So telomere length really equates to anti-aging. The longer your telomeres, the longer those cells are going to stick around. Guess what happens? Increases in cortisol causes a decrease in telomere length. So what's going to happen to those cells? Those cells are not going to live for 40 days or 80 days or 1 year or 2 years. They're going to live a lot less in time. So these cells are going to, because of the telomere length, are going to decrease in their longevity. The blood-brain barrier, which makes cerebrospinal fluid, the blood-brain barrier is compromised due to these cell deaths that occur. And if you compromise the blood-brain barrier, then components that are found in your blood will now enter your cerebrospinal fluid. What are those components? Things like toxins. An increase in toxic activity in the central nervous system can cause deleterious effects in that central nervous system. And because we get enormous amounts of cell death, we know that the size of the brain in patients who are chronically stressed, in animals who are chronically stressed, is actually reduced. So they have smaller brains because of that cell death, because of the number of connections decreasing versus those that are not chronically stressed. So in summary, we have good stress, that's your acute form of stress, and that prepares the body, the brain for peak performance. And we have chronic stress, where we have an increase in this very, very widely acting hormone, cortisol, which can have deleterious effects on the body as well as the brain. Until next time, I will post up some questions that, based on this, that you'll need to answer. And until next time, next week, we'll have another topic to cover. Thanks. Bye.